Hi, everyone. Please do take your seats. We are ready to kick off the final panel for democratizing data. Aside from just offering logistical information throughout the last couple of days, I haven't had a chance to properly introduce myself. My name is Sukti, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Bernstein Institute here at NYU, and it's been our honor at the Institute to really help curate what we hope you all agree has been a really rich and reflective discussion on if this idea of democratizing data is even possible and what it means to really center the most affected in the conversation. So thank you again for being here, and a special thanks again to Brian Brown, who's the program manager at the Institute, and Deidre and a bunch of our student volunteers. There's no way we could have done this without you, and of course Meg Satterthwaite, who's the faculty director. Okay, so this last panel is titled Democratizing Data Analysis, and I really do encourage those of you in the room to please share your insights when we get to Q&A, because we understand that you all have, in your respective areas of work, expertise that we'd love to also be able to bring beyond the fantastic panelists that we have for you here today. As the description describes, this is really thinking about increasingly we're seeing organizations and institutions partnering with grassroots groups, affected communities, to really think about how do we leverage the data that's out there, flawed or not flawed. How do we then deploy open data strategies to make that not only accessible to people, but understandable to people? And how do we just think about transparency in this whole conversation around human rights claiming? And so those are the concepts we're going to be wrestling with today. They obviously are not limited to the panel that we're having right now and have been common threads throughout, but these are really explicit and we believe powerful examples of community partnership and accountability, and I will stop there. So I am going to let each of the panelists introduce themselves, and I will just do a quick intro in terms of your names and your designations. So to the left of me is Cynthia. She's a staff attorney at the Legal Aid Society. We have Julie to her left, who is also at the Legal Aid Society and a research and data analyst there. They're going to be talking through a really exciting site that is, I think, already up on the screen. So really looking forward to that. And then to Julie's left, we have LeVar from the Eviction Lab at Princeton University. And then to his left, we have Jackie, who is a program manager at Witness. So over to you guys. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm a staff attorney. You guys hear me? I'm a staff attorney. Oh, got it. That's why everybody's been holding the microphones. I am a staff attorney at the Legal Aid Society in the Special Litigation Unit of the Criminal Defense Practice. And before I was there, I was actually a civil rights attorney at a small firm in Brooklyn. And there I brought over 100 civil rights lawsuits against police and correction officers in New York City and state. And after about 7 years of litigation, I started to notice a lot of patterns. And there were a lot of small units of officers and individual officers and types of misconduct that really stuck out to me as something that reoccurred over and over again in many of our cases. One squad from the Brooklyn North Narcotics Unit was sued over and over again. A Daily News report in 2013 found that it was unilaterally responsible for $500,000 of settlements in a small time period. There was a unit from the 67th Precinct's anti-crime unit. There was two partners from the anti-crime unit that were being sued over and over again for brutality. And these types of patterns really struck me. And I wanted to do something about them. And yet it was very difficult to come across more information about police officers' misconduct history, because in New York State we have a law called Civil Rights Law 50A, and it was passed in 1976 by activist police unions who wanted to protect police misconduct information from becoming available to defense attorneys primarily. 50A makes it also impossible for the public to get any access of information, and that has been made very clear through a series of cases that I've lost over the past few years. But 50A specifically was targeted at defense attorneys. And so when I joined the Legal Aid Society in 2014, I joined it in order to create a database for defense attorneys so that they could get past the standard in that law, which is to prove that there's information that exists in a misconduct file and that it is relevant to a case, by giving them, at the very least, the publicly known misconduct of officers. Because as you can tell, the standard does something that you can't see exist is pretty hard to meet. So I joined the Special Litigation Unit in 2014, and Julie joined me in 2015. In 2016, we rolled out a database that was available to public defenders in New York City, the Legal Aid Society defenders, and later to other institutional defenders. And the purpose of that database was to serve them so that they could get better results for our clients because they had more information about the officers accusing them of crimes. As we were doing this, we started to build with friends like Witness, including Jackie, and Invisible Institute in Chicago, and started to expand the conversation about why we were collecting data and what we wanted to do with that data, from just being about creating a tool for public defenders in the courtroom to really being about public access and broadening access of information to government misconduct, essentially. And so I am under 5 minutes, yay. And I'm going to hand it over to Julie to actually walk you through the public website that we built using the data that we started collecting in 2015.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay. So before I get to the website, I just wanted to kind of reiterate what Conti just said, that our original purpose for this database was to help our attorneys and our own cases and just get what information we can from public sources to help our clients. Because the DAs, the government, were not handing over any data about prior police misconduct. So we looked to various sources for data, and one of those were civil rights lawsuits. And so we know a lot of experience with police is not actually reaching our clients in the courtroom, but it's happening out in the community, and one of the only ways to seek justice for the injustices that have happened, the civil rights violations, is to file a lawsuit. And so there are a lot of stories being captured in these lawsuits that no one had been collecting before. And so when I joined Conti in 2015, we started downloading these lawsuits every day and kind of analyzing the stories out of them, kind of removing the legal jargon and seeing what actual violations happened there. We expanded the database to other public defenders, but always kind of had a little hesitation to release anything publicly out of fear of kind of misinterpretation. We didn't have a whole story of police misconduct. Other cities have released similar databases where they got every prior allegation against these officers, and we just had what we could find online from these random sources, and didn't want people to draw false conclusions or make a picture of who's this bad cop versus this cop when we don't know the whole story. So a lot of thought went into making this public site, and we ultimately decided that we had done so much work collecting this data, and it was one of the only forms of accountability of these officers that it was worth to make it public. And having it out there in the public will actually improve it. We could crowdsource more data, people could help us correct ours, and it would be affirming for the communities whose stories we actually are collecting to see what else is going on. So this is a picture of what we put online. We took a subset of the federal lawsuits that we collected over those 3 years and had analyzed. And we mapped by the different commands, which commands were involved in each of these lawsuits to see if there's, you always hear about bad apple cops. Is it actually maybe a command directive that's causing issues in this certain community? Is every cop who's going to this command starting to get in trouble? Trying to identify bigger pictures and themes rather than one officer's misconduct, but cultures and policies happening in certain areas that need to be changed. And so this is just the profile of the 75th Precinct, which historically has done a ton of broken windows policing, and it has cost the city the most in federal lawsuits in the past 3 years. And we found, a lot of different teams of officers and different types of abuses happening in that specific area just by collecting this data and looking at the actual allegations within it. We also found or made profiles of each individual officer of what we knew about them, their promotion history, their payroll history, and the lawsuits that have been filed against them in that subset, and other ones we may have become aware of. This also includes data released by BuzzFeed last year that was internal misconduct data that got actually released and made into a public database, and so that is incorporated here. It's been our only insight into how the department actually categorizes allegations against officers and punishes them, or does not punish them. We used a network of associations to, again, try and figure out themes between commands and officers and see if there's bigger issues coming out of this data, more so than just, again, one bad apple caught. And this is an example of the Chicago Police project. Do you want to talk about that one?
Yeah, our project and our website really joins a family of projects that have attempted to get around this data gap, right? Of getting around the problem that police misconduct is one of the things in this country that doesn't go reported, analyzed, and really digested publicly. And it leaves advocates. I've been a part of the Communities United for Police Reform Coalition for many years, and it leaves those advocates, when they are trying to lobby for greater punishment, for example, for unlawful stop and frisks, it leaves them unable to, or incapable really, of arguing to a legislator the current unlawful stop and frisk penalty is X, and we want it to be stronger because we don't even know what X is. So this joins a family of websites from the Invisible Institute and from New Jersey, who recently also did a public report where we're really taking it upon ourselves to fill that data gap, and that's where we see our work fitting into sort of the community of human rights work in democratizing data, I guess.
And so I'll just give a couple anecdotes that, well, the data for one has completely changed the game in our cases. Being able to, allege that this cop might have planted drugs here because we know in 5 other cases they've done it already, was something we never were able to do before. But it also caused us to, reevaluate, or the city to reevaluate their accountability mechanisms for these officers. And they actually just implemented a policy where they have to track and post online their own lawsuit data. So the lawsuits filed against the NYPD, they're required to track and post publicly. What's interesting, though, is that we found a lot of cases that aren't appearing in their data, and so it's still important to have kind of grassroots collection efforts, because if we weren't collecting this at the same time, 100 cases or 350 is what I found could be missing from their data sets, and nobody would know about that. We've also been able to identify multiple incidences of chokehold since Eric Garner's death. Many of you are, I think, from New York City, so you remember that incident, and lawsuits are still being filed against police officers for using chokeholds. We also found that there's a significant correlation between police officers' overtime and the amount of times they're being sued. So we're finding that there's a monetary motivation for abuse. Right, and then there's different networks and there's cultures in different precincts that are actually inciting civil rights violations. And so collecting this data, like I said, it isn't a complete picture. It doesn't let us rank worst cop, worst precinct. This is the exact solution to a problem, but at least gets us closer to what's going on in certain areas, certain communities, and identify different changes, and either try through litigation or policy reform to alleviate some of these violations. And I think that's it, right on time.
Well done. Thank you both. Next up is LeVar from Eviction Lab.
This too works. Awesome. Hi, my name is LeVar Edmonds. I'm a researcher with the Eviction Lab at Princeton University. So I imagine most of you in here have heard of the foreclosure crisis that particularly kicked off around 10 years ago, and millions of households or people lost their houses, communities were ripped through, and it is really been a central feature of the affordable housing conversation nationally for a decade or so. Now, what if I told you that there was something comparable to that happening every year, and that nationally, we had no idea how to quantify it, how many people were affected. That's what we're dealing with evictions. That eviction, which, to be clear, is a landlord-initiated involuntary move that happens to tenants, to renters, is a destabilizing event that has been linked with homelessness, with job loss, with material hardship, with depression. And nationally, we had no idea until about a year ago how many evictions were happening across the country. And so that's part of where my lab comes into play, building off of, it's run by and building off the research of Professor of Sociology, Matthew Desmond, who published the book Evicted 3 years ago, focusing on evictions in Milwaukee. And that sort of gave us a sense of, it fortunately really began to put evictions on the map and really draw attention to the national sort of importance of evictions, but it still wasn't quite enough, right? That's focused on one area. People across the country were still asking him sort of, well, what about eviction in my area? What can we say about it? And there was a national database. And I've been working with the Eviction Lab now for almost 2 years, and it's still sort of difficult to wrap my head around. Can you imagine a world where we didn't know how many people were incarcerated every year, or how many people dropped out of high school? These are all things that are kept at the national level, easily accessible. You can pull out your phone right now and Google it. It wouldn't take very long. Until about a year ago, you couldn't do the same thing for eviction, which is incredible. In 2016, so just to give you a sense, in 2016, not spurred on by any kind of subprime mortgage crisis, just a one-off year in evictions, there were over 3.7 million households receive eviction filings, 1.4 million households, not people, households, so multiple that, I don't know, 2.5 or so, and you can get a number of people, were evicted in 2016. That exceeds the number of foreclosure starts and foreclosures in 2010 at the height of the foreclosure crisis. And still, there was so little we knew about it. And so what we do, even though we are an academic lab, so much of what we are focused on is being a public-facing lab and being very clear about what our data are, where our data come from, and how we can turn a private good into private data into this public good, this resource for everyone. And so we've done that in a number of ways. It started off first by us trying to collect data, because again, if you don't know anything about it, you have to first get these data to try to address the issue. And so we reached out to the every state in the country, trying to get a sense of, well, who has these data? Where are these court records? We were able to get data from 13, maybe 15 states, but that wasn't enough. We needed to go deeper. We ended up partnering with this, after several conversations, this was an ongoing conversation that was had with tenant organizations, these national affordable housing advocates. People from across the country were in agreement, as Matt traveled the country talking about it, we're in agreement that in order to take these private data and transform it into a public good, we had to end up partnering with an organization, LexisNexis, that collected these data, and we were able to spend a year and a half trying to clean and eventually validate and publish these data, all in the effort to make sure that it was very clear for everyone to have access to these data. But it didn't stop just there, right? That as an academic lab, it's often the case in academic spaces that you get a lot of data and you kind of hoard it, right? You maybe publish some stuff, you send it out to a journal, it gets published a year and a half later, and a bunch of academics read it, and that's sort of where it dies. And that was, Matt and the lab were very committed to breaking that trend and making sure that these data were available for everyone. So what did we do? We published it. We took these data and we made a website, and not just, we didn't just outsource it. We hired a web team, which included a user experience consultant who worked with people across several sessions to make sure that these data were understandable, that this data, the website itself was interactive enough to work with people who are affected by this and interested in these issues. And we published a national database of evictions looking over 17 years. You can look at it now, evictionlab.org. Over 17 years of evictions across the country, aggregated from the national level down to the census block group level. But even further, you can look at our maps. You can download the data. You can go to the website, and you can download it right now and get CSVs from block group up to national level of any state you want. You can look at eviction estimates. We've overlaid it with census data, so you can overlay it with demographic and socioeconomic characteristics. Even further, if you want to present this, you're a teacher, you're with some city council, you're an advocate, you want to take these data and present it to someone, on the website we have a feature where you can download the data in a PowerPoint, a customized PowerPoint that'll take the data for your area and use that in your presentations. So, that's a lot of words to say. A huge part of what we've wanted to do is a commitment to, a very democratic, open data collection and presentation. And that has continued throughout this process that we've been working on this. So much of what we do, so much of what I do, I am, by training more of a quantitative researcher, but so much of what we do is ground truthing and speaking with legal aid societies, speaking with tenant organizations, speaking with whoever we can on the ground. We can say, okay, what's happening in your area? Because, we're a team of 8 full-time researchers. There's only so much we can do. So much of it has to be, by nature, needs to be a democratic process. And that involves bringing in as many people as we can to have these different levels of expertise and different experiences with so many all the different ways you can approach it, because it is such a complex issue that it's not something that we could do alone. And so much of this process has been calling upon those actors and having them voice their input and voice their concerns, and it's really, I think, helped us build a better product that continues today. I speak with journalists from across the country. I speak with lawyers from across the country who are very interested in this and very interested in highlighting these issues that until recently were very much on the back burner, unfortunately. That affordable housing is a particularly potent issue across the country, and in the last 15 years or so, we've seen rents increase by around 15%. Incomes have actually dropped around 2 or 3%. So there's a real disconnect between how much people are expected to pay for rent and how much they can actually afford. So much of affordable housing has been spent talking about New York and Seattle and San Francisco, places that are certainly very well affected by affordable housing, but Richmond, Virginia, the capital of my home state, 1 in 9 people were evicted in 2016. No one was talking about eviction in Richmond. 1 in 13 were evicted in Tulsa, Oklahoma. No one was talking about affordable housing in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so, at least at the national level, there are certainly people on the ground doing this kind of work, but that's so much what we're trying to do is really highlight all these areas that have been left out of the conversation and bringing them into the fold and showing, hey, eviction is not just an urban city issue, it's not just a coastal issue, it's not just a large city issue, it's something that affects people across the country, and it's our job to the best of our ability, make that apparent through this very democratic process where you can look right now, download our methodology report, you can see how we collect the data, how we clean the data, and moving forward, making sure that people are part of this conversation, because that's the only way we're ever going to be able to affect change, is to be able to have people from all these different backgrounds a part of this conversation, help us moving forward. So hopefully you all can continue us with that process.
Thank you so much, LeVar. Next up, we have Jackie from Witness.
Can we trade spots?
Oh, yes, let's do that.
While this is getting pulled up, I will just briefly say, one of our partners on this project, Dennis Flores from El Grito de Sunset Park, was just here, but unfortunately had to run out in a work emergency. So I've had to rearrange a few things and going to try to cover what he was talking about, but I'm sorry you don't get to hear from him. Take this. As Sukti mentioned, I am Jackie Zmudo. I'm from an organization called Witness. And most simply put, Witness is an international group that works with human rights defenders to use video and technology to document abuses and to use that content to fight for justice, both in evidentiary settings as well as for advocacy. So the organization has been around for just over 25 years, and in that amount of time, we have seen a major shift in the landscape. So I just want to share a few stats that I think are pretty impressive and terrifying in some ways. One is that there are 500 hours of footage uploaded to YouTube every minute. So if you can just wrap your head around that for a moment, it's kind of crazy to think about how much content is actually out there. And the majority of this content is probably cats and babies and not necessarily human rights content, but it tasks us with a challenge, which is we know there is a lot of valuable human rights content online. How do we make sure that it is being used in a way that it's usable for researchers and investigators, that it's actually findable for people, that it's not being taken down by these tech companies for violating terms of services, even though it could potentially be evidence of war crimes. These are some of the challenges that we're grappling with. And similarly, in 2014, the number of mobile phones exceeded the human population. Want to share this just because it is an astounding statistic, but it also speaks to the great potential that people have now to take this camera that's in their pocket and document what they're seeing in their communities and use this to expose the abuses that are happening. So all of these in some ways are good, but we are often confronted with this challenge of, does more video actually lead to more justice and to more rights? I think for especially, I lead our program here in the United States, and in the past couple of years, we've seen so many horrible videos come out documenting police violence, and so few of those are actually leading to accountability. And so what we're really trying to understand is how can we both create this content in a way that is more likely to be verified and used for justice, and how can we get creative to think about how to use these massive quantities of videos in a more strategic way. And so that is what led us to this collaboration with El Grito de Sunset Park. As we started to kind of do some research in the United States about how video was being used to document police abuse, we started talking with a lot of groups that were Cop Watch groups. And so these are kind of a decentralized network of community organizations that proactively go out and film the police as a de-escalation tactic largely. What we were finding is in the US, which is a little different from other parts of the world, people here were very comfortable with their cell phones, very comfortable with filming. We didn't need, as an organization, to provide a lot of guidance on how to film. What people were really grappling with was, how do you share that in an effective way? And how do you collect and preserve this so that these collections of videos are part of the story? And how do we start telling this narrative that goes beyond a single story? And this is also thinking about, a lot of the videos of police violence that we do see are a police killing or a very violent act. But what we don't see are the videos that are capturing the day-to-day surveillance and harassment of communities, most often vulnerable communities. And so when we started talking with El Grito, they were telling us, we have a closet full of hard drives. We have tons of mini DV tapes because they've been filming for a long time. How can we start to use this as a collection of videos that tell this bigger story? That it's about this day-to-day harassment, it's about the surveillance and threats that we're living under that are really having an effect on the mental health of our population, on our relationships, on the way that we're able to engage in society. So we embarked on this project, and sorry, I forgot which slides I put in here. And what we were trying to do in some ways was really create a use case study to explore the different challenges that we're confronted with. And so what we've tried to tackle through this project in collaboration with El Grito de Sunset Park, which I should just back up and say, for those who are not from New York, Sunset Park is a neighborhood in Brooklyn. It's a largely Latinx and Asian community that has a very rich cultural history, but it is also has a lot of heavy-handed policing. And with this group, El Grito de Sunset Park, they do a lot of Know Your Rights trainings, they do a lot of cop watch patrols, and so they have been really active in kind of challenging the police presence and challenging the narrative, and using this video also to help protect some people in the communities when they're wrongfully convicted of things like resisting arrest. So a lot of their content has actually been used to help free people and get charges dropped. So they're doing really incredible work, and I would highly recommend checking them out. So some of the things we were dealing with this project was not just specific to El Grito, but this is stuff we were hearing from our partners all over the world. As we have these huge collections of videos, how do we make the most of them? And then from lawyers, we're also hearing, we know there's content online of these issues happening, but we don't know how to find it. So we wanted to really create a way for these groups to better collect the videos that they were either filming or receiving, how to organize them in a more strategic way, how to analyze them, preserve them for the long term, and then ultimately think about some creative ways to use them for storytelling. And this, again, is addressing the fact that in the US right now, there is no comprehensive database about police misconduct information. Definitely nothing like that in New York, with the exception of the new CAPSTAT. So we wanted to try to experiment with some ways to use video and open source data, both to corroborate the incidents that we were seeing, but also develop these bigger narratives. And this is really also an exercise in preserving community memory and kind of challenging some of the more traditional archiving practices that really place the power in the hands of the institutions to determine what is preserved, what is held onto, what stories are told, and place this into the hands of the communities and let them decide. Even though a lot of these videos were documenting horrible things, they're still an important piece of the history of this place, and it's important to let these communities decide how they're used and talked about and shared. So that was part of it. And then, of course, this project is also addressing exactly what Kanti was talking about, this law in New York called Repeal 50A, which in many ways really puts the burden of proof on the community to show what's happening, to show the police misconduct, and to continue pushing the advocacy. So this project, just a quick snapshot, and I'll breeze through the rest of these. El Grito had a lot of videos, and so what we did for this was narrow it down to a set of videos over about 10 years that had been, all of these videos came out of the Sunset Park Puerto Rican Day Parade, which is a parade that El Grito helped organize. It had been happening for over a decade, and almost every year had been met with a lot of police violence. And so it seemed like a good sample set for us to work from. We worked with some awesome volunteers. El Grito was instrumental in helping us review and analyze the videos. Part of this process was also digitizing some of the mini DV tapes. Throughout this process, we also reached out to a lot of different advisors. Again, some of the people at this table were really helpful in teaching us how to think about data, how to think about video as data, which is still an open question, is how useful is video as data beyond the metadata. Got some really good feedback about when you start analyzing the videos, don't just make assumptions about what you're gonna see. Really live with that content, work with the community group to understand what's in here, and that ended up being really valuable. And being careful about the use of the word pattern was really crucial, and something that has resonated for the rest of the project. These are just some snapshots of the videos. Just wanted to quickly show, as we started watching them, we knew that there were some things we definitely had to track for each video, like the location and date. And then in the second column, you can see some of the things that started actually to come up that we in no way expected, but ended up being really valuable to capture. And probably one of the most useful ones was, when are people denied the right to record? In the United States, we do have the right to film the police in public spaces, and we kept coming across videos that the police said you can't film, or they confiscated the camera, or you can just see like a hand going into the camera and then the video ends. So it was interesting to see what kind of stuff came out of this. We also experimented with doing an officer profile. So again, as we were working with El Grito, we were hearing stories over and over again about specific officers. And so what we wanted to try to do was create a timeline where we put the different videos of officers that they had documented alongside other open source data that we were able to find. Again, thank you to Legal Aid in many cases and teaching us how to do this. The open source data about police salary information, so that we could show that despite this officer being involved in multiple incidents of misconduct, they were continuing to receive raises and promotions, and in some cases even being like the poster child for community policing, which was strange, but that's the kind of content we included in the timeline. Really thinking about this as like a model for storytelling for repeat offender cops, and trying to push the narrative away from one bad apple and showing more of the systemic abuse that was happening. In all of this process, we documented our workflows and methodologies and created a toolkit that's available on the site. So this has ended up being useful in helping think about how to create metadata structures with communities, how to digitize mini DV tapes. Everything's free and Creative Commons, so if this is something you're interested in, please check it out. I'd be happy to walk you through it. Just to quickly touch on some of the big challenges we faced, safety and security, both in the sense of like, what El Grito initially wanted was an online database that they could use, but we were not able to find secure server space that we could afford or that would meet our needs. So that was one of the biggest challenges we were facing. But of course, just safety of the people doing this work. And as you probably know, many people who have put their lives on the line to document these types of abuses become targets. And this is something we're constantly reminded of in cases like Ramsey Orta, who's the young man that filmed Eric Garner. Because of his video, people around the world learned about Eric Garner's death, and now Ramsey is serving 4 years in prison for unrelated charges, even though most people think they're somewhat related because he became a target. His whole family became a target. So we're very cautious of this and cautious of people calling out the police. It looks like my Wi-Fi dropped when I tried to edit the second point, which I'm trying to remember what it was. So I'll skip to ethics. So ethics, just thinking about a lot of different, it was secure sites, which I tried to edit because I was like, I can cover that in safety and security, but there was another thought there, and I was a little rushed. So, so if anyone has other ideas, let me know. So ethics, a lot of this has been touched on throughout the past couple of days, but thinking about the consent of people who are documented in these videos. For example, some of the videos we shared on the site had already been released publicly, but we were cautious about re-traumatizing people, recognizing that these had been really horrible moments in people's lives, and did actually reach back out to these families and say, hey, we want to let you know that this is part of a project, and we want to just give you a heads up. If you would prefer for us to blur your face out or not use this at all, we're open to doing that, but really just trying to operate on the human rights principles that we're led by in terms of requesting people's consent and acting ethically. Sustainability, this was a challenging project for us to take on. It's not, we only got really a fraction of where we wanted to go, which we learned a ton out of, and it was incredibly valuable. But in recognizing the need for these types of databases and database resources for groups that are documenting police abuse, we just need more support. And more importantly than that, I think, is collaboration. And it's not something that a group can take on by themselves. I think also when you talk to funders about supporting an archive or a database, they see it as kind of this static tool and don't fully recognize that it is a living, breathing resource and that it is operated by living, breathing people. And in order to have an effective archive or database, you need the people behind that. And so we're trying to kind of push funders into recognizing that, and we still have a ways to go. And then just to wrap up, want to quickly touch on where this has gone since we released the project last June. What's that?
So we should do that again.
We should do this again. So we had a mini data and policing convening with the Invisible Institute, with Julie and Conti were both there. And we brought together a number of journalists, technologists, activists, lawyers in the room to talk about all of this. And I think it was a very introductory space where we were really just learning about the different work people were doing, the challenges that people had. But it ended up really helping build some relationships and develop a deeper understanding. And I think in some ways, really help people see the ecosystem of different organizations and individuals who are working on this. And so hopefully we can have a round two, and I know there's a lot of people in the room who I would love to also invite. And then what we're doing with this now is we've kind of we're in the midst of a phase 2 with a group called Berkeley Cop Watch that has been around for about 30 years and did have a database, but were not very, they weren't using it and it didn't really meet their needs. So we've been kind of taking all of our learnings and the fancy spreadsheet that we built with El Grito, which was our database, and adapting it into a more relational database using FileMaker Pro. This image here is us doing kind of a community-led data mapping and data structuring, which was really fun and actually got people thinking in creative ways. And this work has also helped inform a lot of the work that we're doing around the world. So we are working in Burma with people who are documenting human rights abuses there and helping them collect and archive not just the documentation, but social media around that and things that could potentially be used in evidence of crimes against humanity or war crimes. In Brazil, we're about to work with some public defenders there on creating a database of video evidence, which I think will be really crucial because it's something that, you know, the police violence there is just at astronomical proportions, and I think it's some crazy number, like only 98% or only 0.8% of cases of police killings ever get investigated. And usually when they do, it's because there's been a video, and it's because there's been some public awareness around this. So they're recognizing the value of this and wanting to be more strategic in how they collect everything. So that's all. I hope I didn't go too far over.
So as you all can see, there is a lot among those, as we say in every panel, among the 4 presentations. So I don't want to take up too much of the space and time because I'd really love to hear questions from you all out there. But one thing that strikes me from all of them, all of your presentations, is that the work you're doing is really telling a story. You're addressing, I think some of you called it like a data gap through the building of these databases. And the hope in some way is that this data forms and is part and parcel of action to kind of address the human rights violation at issue. And so thinking about that and thinking about power dynamics and hierarchies for which we all labor under, in these initiatives, you're really making visible human rights violations by incredibly powerful actors. May they be the state, may they be companies, may they be private landlords. And I just wonder, from your personal experiences, what kind of challenges you experience vis-a-vis those actors, if any. And this is related, and I imagine might be a response from these actors, is that what you're putting together is a theme that's come up a lot throughout the last couple of days, is proving quote unquote legitimacy, or proving that your data is credible, or that it's not quote biased. And I think we've been problematizing the fact that data is inherently biased and political and powerful, but in the technocratic speak, it's not supposed to be. So how do you think about those things in your particular projects? And anyone can go.
The problem was really presented by police in the 70s. When police unions were first forming in the 70s, creating these law enforcement Bill of Rights, and specifically creating a privacy right around their misconduct data was their main organizing point. So in terms of how the actors about whom we're trying to understand data challenge us, they presented their challenge decades ago, and it's really only now that we're pushing back and really demanding that that data be shared with us, that we are again realizing that they created the problem. privacy doesn't, police claims to privacy of their misconduct information is not protected by the Constitution, and they've lost state claims to privacy under similar arguments. And so that is what caused their initiative in the 70s, either through state statutes or through collective bargaining agreements where they didn't allow the municipality that they were bargaining with to release their information. They created the problem. It was very intentional. It was done not just through sort of a lack of forethought about carving out police officer misconduct. It was very intentionally done to us all. And there's a lot of harms that really result from that level of state secrecy. And so I think that that's the biggest challenge, right? Is that we're just working in a system that assumes this information is not something the public should have. And I don't know if anyone read the New York Post op-ed yesterday from the Sergeant Benevolent Association head Ed Mullins, but he actually suggests that it's dangerous to everyone for us to know police misconduct information, because he claims that no one will be safe if the community doesn't trust police, and basically says that we're better off in the dark. And that's a really dangerous fundamental assumption to make when determining what amount of government misconduct information we should have available to us in a democracy.
Yeah, I'll just go off that. It is interesting that our project is kind of like reversing the lens, and we don't expect police to have the same privacy rights as civilians. I mean, they're given a badge and a gun and can lethally take someone's life, so they should be held to a greater accountability standard than a regular civilian. At the same time, we've been shown time and time again that they're not being held accountable, and so this is our attempt to look at those mechanisms and how they are failing. But at the same time, they keep this data on us and release it on our clients almost as soon as one of our clients are arrested. Their rap sheet is made public. That's on the front page of the news. And an officer shoots a civilian, and that civilian's information is what's being released, but not that officer's history of misconduct. So it's an attempt to kind of give a counter narrative. I mean, the name CAPSTAT is kind of a play off the city's CompStat, which does collect data about us. So yeah, I guess we're reversing the lens, but it's to hold people accountable who have more power than us and who should be held to higher standards.
I can quickly touch on the question about data analysis and who's an expert, because that was actually the point that was missing off my slide and the whole purpose that we're up here. So data analysis was really hard in this project we were working on because A, we are definitely not experts, but we had the privilege of working with El Grito, who are living this experience and knew it very deeply. But what we found to be really hard is how do we tag videos and how do we analyze videos using language that's really problematic and that's also not seen as factual. For example, if you see a video where a young man gets hit with a baton, a community member might say, that was my son, he was assaulted. But the police might not see that as assault. They might never have any documentation that that event even happened. So if we're gonna tag a video that there was an assault, for the community, that's very valuable and very important, but what other spaces can we be using that? How do we make sure that those definitions that we're using are both transparent and accessible? One of the things we realized in this process is there is no metadata standards around describing video of police misconduct. And we're not really about to start creating those standards because that's a major uphill battle and not really one we want to go on. But one of the ways we are addressing this now with Berkeley CopWatch is creating a data dictionary and working with them to define what these terms are. In some cases using what the police definitions are, but really trying to make sure that it speaks to the community and also so that there is more consistency in the way the data is being tracked. And ultimately, I think what we're finding is that just having a collection of videos organized in a really clear way is very valuable and really helps corroborate other sources of data, even when the video maybe isn't providing factual data itself. That's more just in a documentation of what happened, which again is interpreted through different ways, as we know, even with the Rodney King video. Like, that video actually was used by the police to get the police officers off, even though it had sparked massive riots around the world about police misconduct. So we've seen video be useful, but also backfire. And so we're trying to kind of get out of that dual notion of it's true or false or not. So.
So, speaking to, I guess, the first question, I guess both questions sort of align together, really. But certainly with our database and publishing our research, first, we're very fortunate that largely it's been very well received across the country, that people from local, state, and federal government and housing advocates from across the country have reached out to us and really been it's been well received and had lots of very informative conversations about how to improve our data. But yes, certainly there have been lots of challenges to our data from different areas. I certainly have. I broke the cardinal rule of the internet, which is don't read the comment sections of articles that I've been interviewed for, because it's very tough when you're working with the kind of data we are, because so much of it is so much of responses are rooted in these knee-jerk reactions to ideas about poverty and about impoverished households. And so, when you go out there and you start talking about something like eviction, there are going to be a ton of people who are like, oh, you didn't pay your rent. You gotta go and go on the street. You gotta be homeless, which I think kind of sounds silly when it hits the air, but it's a reality that we receive. Certainly comments from there, but and there are certainly comments from like landlords who, everyone has their story of this type of tenant and this issue and this person and. A main feature of our website actually is that we publish a ranking of evictions, highest ranking large cities, mid-sized cities, small cities. And we've, in certain areas, very, very few, but in certain areas we've gotten pushback from people in those areas, government officials who have thought, like this, maybe you didn't calculate it correctly. There's no way eviction is that bad in my area. Surprise, it is. And so what we've been trying to make clear is that eviction is a process, it's a system that doesn't work for anyone, that it's problematic for tenants, it's problematic for landlords. Less discussed, it's problematic for courts, that the court systems are very much overburdened with eviction cases to the point that many times they do not have the resources to facilitate hearing all these cases. They're sort of banking on most tenants not being able to make it to their court hearing, otherwise the courts would implode. And so, this isn't the kind of thing, sort of looping in the bias question. I think a huge part of addressing the biases is just being very transparent about where our data come from, how we clean the data, and what we're presenting, and making sure that we are doing, to the best of our ability, amplifying a diversity of voices in the conversation. Thinking about research we're doing now, one of my colleagues went down to Alabama and South Carolina for a month and interviewed not just tenants, but also landlords about their experiences. That's sort of a microcosm of what we've been trying to do, of making sure that, yes, there are going to be people from all different sides, tenant-friendly, landlord-friendly. From every angle, there are always going to be people who are going to have some sort of pushback and issue with the data that we're putting out there. But the way we found to approach that is to say, all right, well, join us. That it's one thing to raise issues and highlight problems in situations, but it's another thing to pose solutions. And I think we've definitely strived our best to make sure that people are included in helping us find those solutions and figure out what is going to be a system that works for everyone.
Thank you. So I could keep asking questions, but I turn it over to the audience. If you guys have any reflections or you do this type of work in your own capacities, please go for it. Yeah.
So for LeVar,
Sure.
for the when you were getting the eviction data, did you receive any resistance from the state governments or local governments, and like where the eviction data is located? And out of all the eviction data sets that you received, were most of them aggregated, or did you receive like incident level data, and why did you decide to display the data in the block group, and or, I guess depending on the availability of the data?
Sure.
Can I just ask for the group if there's certain vocabulary that many of us may not understand to kind of help us understand that terminology?
Sure. So block groups. So I'll start
Yes,
there.
like that one.
Yeah. So the census, the U.S. Census, more or less aggregates data at different geographic levels. Obviously, you have national level, you have the state, you have counties or cities, and then as you get smaller and smaller, there are just sort of units of aggregation from individuals. So there's like the census tract, which certain circuits might think of like a neighborhood. A block group is sort of a tier below that. A block is even smaller there. So it's just sort of these different groupings of residents across the country. So I think there are 3 questions in there. So hopefully I can get through all of them. So first, pushback more or less, like I said, the project started with trying to request data from each state individually. And I think we got to 13 or 15 states in that way. Pushback, I would say, only came in the sense that some states have legal restrictions on accessing those data. Like I want to say, no, I'm not going to put anybody on blast because I might forget. But there are certainly situations, certain states that have legal barriers to access it. I mean, that's why we only end up with 15 or so states when there are 50, because some states just don't allow access to that. What we ended up publishing, because technically eviction cases are public data, but we got it from a private organization, so we certainly have legal restrictions on what we can publish at the individual level. Technically, from the court records, what we did receive were individual level records of court cases. We received, between 2000 and 2016, roughly 83 million eviction court records that we spent a year and a half combing through. So we do have it at the individual level, but for a variety of reasons, we aren't able to publish those at the individual level, and because they're identifying information, you can't really put out there someone's name and address. And so the best we could do, and for making this apparent, the best we could hope for was to publish it down to the block group level, just to show, okay, so we can't show you individual people who are being evicted, but we can at least give you a sense of what eviction is like in your area. And so far, it's been very well received by people, certainly policymakers and stakeholders, who are able to go onto the website, even if you don't have a particularly robust data analysis background, you're not super well versed in quantitative research, you're able to access these data pretty quickly and really intuitively get a sense of what eviction is like in your area. And we found that and hopefully you all agree, is certainly a step in the right direction and far more, relays far more information than we knew about eviction prior to that.
So maybe we can take questions in threes. So we have Fike and then Tawana and Sita ahead.
Hi, thank you for all your amazing projects. I have a question for Jackie. When you do archiving and especially investigations in videos, when we talk about data, videos can be quite traumatizing to sort of archive them and live through them. And not just for the people in the image, but especially also for the volunteers in El Grito de Sunset Park and for the witness staff. So I was wondering if you have any mechanisms to cope with this?
Tawana, let's just take 3 at a time and then we'll respond.
So I'm from Detroit, and I know you probably know about our evictions. I'm sure you know about our evictions. We're suffering the highest rent increase in the country right now, as well as water shutoffs and contributing to evictions. And I'm wondering if you see a theme in like water and access to water or water shutoffs across the country impacting the eviction rates.
Thanks so much for your presentations. I have so many questions, and I'm going to try and narrow it. I was trying to think of a question that could apply to all 3, and I think it's actually just going to apply to the 3 of you.
That's
so
fine.
I'll get you
Thank
afterwards.
You for considering me.
But one of the things that you mentioned while speaking is that you work with a number of collaborators, or not that you, well, not that you don't work with collaborators, but that there are a number of other groups that you work with or that are doing similar things to what you're doing. Did I get that right? And Jackie, you mentioned, you have this kind of really unique relationship with a community-based organization that's experiencing things. So and you showed that slide of, this meeting that took place in Chicago. And I'm just wondering where, if you could expand on where journalists fit into that ecology, and also archivists or librarians, because as you were speaking and talking about the longevity of these projects and the politics and funding and all of that, that's a part of that. It just made me wonder, like, well, yeah, journalists definitely seem to have a role here, but what about librarians and archivists that could also be part of a living library and assist with what you're trying to do?
So feel free to answer in any order, guys. Maybe LeVar, actually I'll help LeVar.
Sure. So yeah, it's a great question that I wish we were able to address more of, or address more closely, and so I'll do the best I can with it. So the issue is that, so as I mentioned before, in 2016, we saw 3.7 million eviction filings, 1.4 million eviction judgments on the households in 2016. But that's still, to make the situation a little grimmer, that's sorely undercounting how many evictions are actually happening, because we are looking at only formal evictions or evictions that were handled through some sort of court proceeding. That still does not begin to address informal evictions. Situations where the landlord, legally or illegally, may sort of push a tenant towards leaving the household. So for instance, that wouldn't include if there is any kind of, and that's like one thing we want to look at is things like water shutoffs or things after, like, say, natural disasters, something like maybe in Texas. Asking questions of, like, if there is some sort of situation where the landlord, rightfully or not, sort of doesn't renew the lease, that's kind of like an eviction, but it wasn't handled through a court proceeding, and so we aren't able to capture those. And so, yes, unfortunately, there are, like, salient issues like that around the country that we are still going to have to, push a little more to try to get a sense of, because they're not going to be captured in our data. That is something, like, we've been partnering with, for instance, like the American Housing Survey, to try to ask questions, include a question about informal evictions, and try to get a sense of what that looks like proportionally across the country. We do know from Matt's previous research that informal evictions, there are a lot relative to formal evictions. I think he may have estimated at maybe twice as many in Milwaukee. So certainly we're going to be running into the issue of undercounting evictions, but it's a very important issue that we're hoping to be able to factor in a number of ways that people are being evicted.
I guess I'll just start by saying that I didn't realize the power of connecting our work to archivists and librarians until 30 years of police misconduct data was removed from City Hall archives in response to one of our FOIL requests. And I'm still waiting for the historian or the librarian to really write that history according to how significant it is to remove misconduct data, government misconduct data from a City Hall library. But that was really when I began to think of the work that we were doing as documenting history and filling a gap for historians to really look back at and to correct, like Jackie said, the stories that are missing, the stories that are painful to listen to, but nevertheless portray how people in New York City are treated by the police department. And I think Jackie will take over. She invited archivists and journalists to the conversation we had in Chicago, and the Invisible Institute is a journalist-inspired organization. Jamie Calvin from Chicago organizes it, and he was a part of the Freedom of Information requests that led to the 30 years of police misconduct information being publicly accessible. And then it was through his sort of recognition of, God, what do I do with everything I asked for, that he invited data scientists in to really come and start to build the public website that they've built.
Yes, and the website is amazing, and I would recommend anyone looking at it because it's a really creative use of how to do data visualizations, and you can dig really deep into specific officers. But to archivists, first of all, I just want to give a shout out to our colleague Yvonne Ing, who is the witness archivist, and she is a total badass, and she has taught myself and all of my colleagues basic archiving principles, and has really been integral in the Profiling the Police project, but in all of the work that we're doing, she's helping people understand the importance of archiving, which oftentimes gets overlooked, or it's not something that people think about until after a project is over, or, you know, it's just, for a long time, archiving has just not been a sexy thing, and we're trying to change that. And so I think archivists can play a really important role, but there's a lot of conversations in that world that still need to happen, challenging the power dynamics of who's preserving these stories, who's collecting them, who has access to them. And so I think one of the things that she's doing really effectively is facilitating those conversations and helping archivists and librarians think about the role that they can play, whether it's offering up a space or teaching people on how to digitize content. You know, there's really incredible initiatives around the cities, around New York City and the libraries here, which I know have hosted some of the discotheques that we heard about yesterday. So I think they can play a really important role, and they can continue pushing the institutions about this notion of like who owns our stories. And I think that, yeah, I just think that it really should be an integral part in all of this work, is thinking about like, how do we preserve this content? As we know, you know, just thinking about the stuff we saw today on Guatemala, human rights justice or human rights change takes a long, long time. And sometimes we've seen videos that our partners have filmed like 10 years ago actually be used in courts, because that's how long the process takes. But if they hadn't been preserved correctly, or if people didn't know where to find them, or if the file had been corrupted, that might have been a huge missed opportunity. So I do think archivists play a huge role, as do journalists, in helping tell the stories and pitching the stories and helping do some of the investigative research, which grassroots communities often don't have to do. But also journalists can sometimes be better listeners. And you know, one of the things that Dennis has expressed a lot of frustration around is, I've been telling the stories of these same police officers over and over and over again, and no one is willing to put in the effort to connect the dots. Even when he has multiple videos of multiple officers repeating misconduct and bad behavior, oftentimes these stories just get overlooked or denied. So I think that there's some room for growth there as well. And there are some journalists doing really amazing work on this. So I also want to give a shout out to that. And then briefly on the question about trauma, don't want to speak on behalf of El Grito, because I know that documenting these videos, having experienced police violence themselves, has affected them in a lot of ways. And those are conversations that we've had. We've tried to offer some resources when we can around that. But I can speak more to my own personal experience and staff at Witness. And the whole idea of vicarious trauma is something that I learned about in the past couple of years, and it's real. And it's this idea that people who might not be directly involved in these situations are affected by the abuses themselves, but are in a position to watch them. So human rights workers, journalists, are affected by this and do carry some of the trauma. And I think in the past couple of years, there's been some really great resources. The Columbia Journalism School has the DART Center, which provides some great resources on vicarious trauma. Through our own organization at Witness, our ED has been really pushing all of the staff to prioritize their own mental health and well-being, which is something I really appreciate and recognize is still kind of unique in this space. And I think ultimately what it comes down to are, you know, it's great that we have these resources, but I find myself struggling to make the time to actually deal with some of this stuff, but I've been trying to do a little bit better of that. But it definitely affects people in different ways, and that kind of trauma can manifest itself in dangerous and harmful ways. So it is something that is really important to take into account. And I think that it's not just videos. I think data in general can be really horrifying to look at, even if it's not so visual. So thank you.
On that note, and I think we can take a couple more questions before we close, but I also asked Katie, who works with Meg Satterthwaite here at the Bernstein Institute and with the Global Justice Clinic, they're doing some research on well-being. So if you want to just share a little bit about that research, Katie, while we take, and then we can take a couple more questions before we close.
Hi, everyone. Oh, sorry, Michael.
Maybe Katie, just share a little bit, and then we'll take some questions.
Okay. Thank you very much for that question, Fika, and thank you for your answer. My name's Katie Whiteman. I'm a fellow with the Global Justice Clinic, and I'm working with Meg Satterthwaite on the Human Rights Resilience Project, and that's an interdisciplinary research initiative involving psychologists and lawyers and human rights advocates. And the purpose is to really promote and raise awareness about supporting, enhancing mental health and resilience within the human rights space. So as we all know, mental health is a long-standing stigmatized issue, but particularly in the human rights space, for various reasons. But the project has been working on this issue for a number of years. I came on board last year, but we're just wrapping up a 2-year study that's looking at what human rights organizations all over the world are and are not doing to enhance the mental health of advocates. And we've got a paper that's about to be published next month, actually. But we've learned so much from advocates all over the world, specifically on organizational practices. So I think there's already a lot of talk about self-care practices, what you need to do as an individual to look after your mental health. But this study is focused purely on organizational strategies and tactics. And perhaps we can circulate the paper to all the people that we have email addresses for once it's published next month. But thanks, Sukti.
You had a question?
Yeah, I had a question, yeah. Okay, so I'm Shirima Shuke. I'm actually from New York City. So, and Mr. Lava, so when it comes to like the housing issue and the eviction issue, wondering if you guys have looked at gentrification and evictions, also race and evictions, also the fact that our judges, judges have immunity, they're being held accountable when they ignore data and just rule in favor of the landlords. So we already know, like in New York City, there's a huge problem that I think it's about 3% or so of the tenants actually go to court with a lawyer. But you have cases where the tenant doesn't owe any money, the tenant has a lease, and the judge judges because they know the lawyer and they don't have a relationship with them, they just choose to ignore. And usually the court is not held accountable, or the city or the state is not held accountable for hiring the judge, and most tenants will not organize against such issues.
Great. Any other questions? We have two right there.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. I was just wondering, thinking about like the digital divide, and also like a few of you guys spoke about New Jersey, like New Jersey's deemed like a media desert. So like thinking about how there aren't a lot of news outlets to share like the really good work you guys are doing, like have you guys explored like other ways of getting this work out there, maybe like exhibits or like talks that are more public facing, or I don't know. I'm just wondering if you were thinking about that or doing that, if you could share.
I think she had a question. Was there another hand over here?
Yeah.
I have a question for Cynthia and Julie. I'm interested in the, you mentioned that you gather police misconduct histories, and that's been useful in your practice as attorneys. I'm interested in the extent to which, or any difficulties you face getting that data in front of judges, like if it's essentially tendency evidence and what the rules of evidence provide in that space, whether it actually does assist in securing the outcome that you want for your clients. So.
Great. One last question, or we're good? I think. Okay. So LeVar, would you like to start?
Sure.
I keep picking on you, I
No,
apologize,
it's
just because
fine,
you're
it's
just
fine.
standing next to me.
Happy to be a part of the conversation. So yes, there are a lot of things in that question. See if I can get through all of them. So gentrification, yes, absolutely. It was something we were very interested in and looking to study. And there's actually one of my colleagues is working on a paper now to try to link the two. So far, what I've seen is, unsurprisingly, it's complicated, right? So a colleague and I are working on a paper right now that we're finishing up about eviction judgment amounts. And in addition to not knowing how many people are being evicted across the country, we also didn't know how much people were being evicted for. So we've been using our data where we have the data to try to estimate, well, how much people are being evicted for? What do the eviction judgments look like? Spoiler alert, it looks like it's somewhere around $1,100 a month, or around, on the median, 1.34 months worth of back rent. In some places, it's for less than 1 month's rent. But in that paper, we look at, say, gentrification, and seeing if gentrification has any kind of relationship with, sort of accounting for variation in eviction judgment amounts. And we're not seeing much. But I think part of the issue is that it might go to a question of informal evictions. That with gentrification, it may not necessarily, because I was, intuitively, I was thinking, well, if these neighborhoods are gentrifying, maybe as neighborhoods become more of a hot market, the landlord has an incentive to try to push the tenant out of the residence. Well, maybe that's true, but maybe the mechanism is different. Maybe it's not going through a court proceeding. Maybe it's just, for whatever reason, legitimate or not, the lease is not being renewed. And so now the tenant has to leave, and now you can usher in new people. That's not something we would capture with our data because it didn't go through a court proceeding. So that makes it a little trickier. But I think it's definitely a very interesting question and very important question, and definitely part of what we're looking to explore moving forward. And looking at race, second part, looking at race. One, I will say it's tricky to do causal stuff, just because our data are court records, and we don't have individual characteristics like that about race, like race or gender or income, anything like that in the data. But what we can see largely is, and this is why having stuff at the block group level and on up is very important, we can look across the country and we see, when you look at the national map at evictionlab.org, when you look at the national map, you can see very clearly that rates of eviction, high rates of evictions, particularly correlate with the proportion of black residents in a neighborhood. That it's especially high in the South and in the Mid-Atlantic states. You're seeing eviction is particularly high in these black neighborhoods. And so, of course, being a quantitative researcher, I can't say for sure that's a causal story, but time and time again, as people have looked nationally and in other offshoot places, they're saying there's something happening, there's some sort of relationship in black neighborhoods. Going back to what I mentioned earlier about the paper working on eviction judgment amounts, we're seeing, for instance, that black tenants are being evicted for less money in white neighborhoods in a way that we're not seeing in white neighborhoods, and in black neighborhoods. In majority white neighborhoods, we're seeing black tenants being evicted for roughly $325 less than what white tenants are being evicted for. And so again, we don't have the data right now to suggest a causal story, but there is some sort of relationship happening here that's important. In terms of sort of judge accountability, that is tricky, right? That there certainly is probably, there's probably some component there of sort of the court system and how it intersects with eviction. So much of, hill that I'm willing to die on is making sure it's very clear that eviction is far more complex than just a simple landlord-tenant interaction. That it is something. It's the result of a systematic issue, and it goes through the courts themselves are not sort of neutral intermediaries or bystanders in the process. That there is a real legal component. Time and time again, we're seeing there's a huge discrepancy in landlord representation and tenant representation. As a civil issue, tenants are not legally afforded legal representation the same way you would see in a criminal case. So the vast majority of tenants, when they are able to appear in court, are unrepresented. Contrasted with landlords, where we're seeing 80, 85, 90%, maybe higher, landlords are represented in court. So there's already going to be an imbalance there, and so it is a system, as I've said time and time again, it's a system that doesn't work for anyone, but surely there is a legal component there and a court component, judicial component that does need to be pressed on, I think, a little more to try to understand what are all these other important factors that are contributing to ultimately the eviction of millions of people every year.
I can briefly touch on your question about operating in media deserts. Luckily, we've been in New York City where we've collaborated with journalists and researchers throughout the entirety of this project because they've relied on us for data when they're breaking stories and vice versa. So we did have a good relationship with them to break the news of this website, but we've also encountered a lot of journalists who don't want to write about just the existence of data, but they want that strong headline, like what is the theme that you found? What's, how much has this cost the city? And give us all your data so we can analyze it and find some groundbreaking truth, which wasn't really the goal. Our goal was to kind of just put this out there for anyone to get out of it what they want to get out of. So we aren't really seeking those stories. We do luckily have a community justice unit within our organization who works with a bunch of different community groups, and we plan on going around and having trainings with them so to make sure that the public actually knows how to use this tool for their purposes. We wish we could clone ourselves and make those happen a lot more places a lot faster. The goal is that it'll spread and get the word out there. We also want to work with civil rights attorneys and teach them how to use it as well so they can use this data in their cases. And start more of a community of, okay, this happened to you, and people can reach out to each other if they've had the same type of abuse. So yeah, I think it's just getting feet on the ground and getting out of the office and behind our screens and going and teaching people how to use it.
And I'll speak to your question about judges and what they think of us. So there's been a lot of litigation. These are called Gissendaner motions in criminal court, if anyone cares. And the Gissendaner motions, our attorneys cite to lawsuits very often because that's the only publicly known misconduct of these officers. And they have to do that, right? Because they're filing a subpoena in order to find out what's in the internal record, even though the standard asks us to argue there is an internal record and that it's relevant to our case. We just can't do that without access to it. So we're already in a difficult, circular, speculative world when we're filing these motions, and so we rely on lawsuits. And up until 2016, there were a lot of cases where judges said, you can't rely on lawsuits for this. Lawsuits are just allegations, and anybody can file a lawsuit. And this isn't actual proof. And because probably 95% or more of civil rights cases in New York City are settled, the judges were saying these are settled cases, so nothing was even proven. And they sort of run on the assumption that civil rights attorneys don't do any investigation before filing lawsuits and that they don't have, ethical guidelines or anything that prevent them from just like slapping some words on paper and filing it. But nevertheless, judges were very reluctant until 2016. But in 2016, there was a Court of Appeals case called People v. Charles Smith, and there were 2 companion cases connected to it. And the Court of Appeals said, this isn't rocket science. It's very possible to have a good faith basis to believe that allegations and lawsuits are reliable for the purposes of cross-examination of a police officer, and that very easily translated into also relying on allegations of a lawsuit for the purposes of Gissendaner motions. So there's still some pushback, and very even to today, when we walk into a courtroom and we have lawsuits that we want to cross-examine an officer about, we do get a lot of pushback. And when we do even get the civilian complaints, we get pushback if the outcome was unsubstantiated rather than substantiated, despite the fact that unsubstantiated basically just means inconclusive. So we certainly have feedback or pushback from the judges, but we have been able to force them to accept lawsuit allegations as a basis.
Okay, so we are unfortunately coming to a close, but I think the words that you just said, Cynthia, the phrase pushback is really beautifully describes what we've been doing the last couple of days. I will do that. I think really pushing back against systems of oppression through creative ground truthing strategies to slow down, to honor the lands before us, to really see that the data that surrounds us is not fixed and is political. And so thank you all for being a part of this gathering, for coming from far and near to share this space. It's really an honor. And all of the videos from the panels will be live on our website. Everyone's plugging their websites, but it's 2019 NYUBernsteinConference.org. But please do visit that in the next couple of weeks, because these conversations are really not meant to just sit here. They're meant to be our own version of a living archive. So we do ask you to turn back to those and really share widely within your networks. And we're really lucky because Sita, who is with our data bodies and sitting in the front row, has some resources, the Digital Defense Playbook. So if you're interested in hard copies, she's up in the front row and eagerly happy to probably relieve some of that burden of carrying that box around. So please do join her there. And that's it. So please welcome, let me thank all of our panelists today. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here.